In the second half of the 20th century, New Orleans shifted from a tripartite to biracial society, in which people were socially and legally categorized as either white or black, much earlier than other American cities by dint of the consolidation of Jim Crow segregation. This resulted in a vast gap of opportunities between the respective positions within the racial dichotomy. One of the major systems put in place to bind this inequality was residential segregation, and it is important to note that the residential segregation of New Orleans occurred in stages over the course of the 20th century. But during the time of Jim Crow laws, many of the affluent white folks moved to the surrounding suburbs that were created by draining the swampland around the edges of the city. African Americans looking to also buy a house in the suburbs were often denied that chance because of the racism that was still practiced by the realtors and bankers. This had a profound impact on New Orleans because many businesses out in the city went bankrupt and lost all of their money. The population of African Americans in the city grew during this time, and because of the low wages that they were earning, could only afford the houses in the city. But the city as a whole only saw a 3% increase in their population at the time, while the suburbs surrounding New Orleans grew a substantial 60%. Additionally, the civil rights movement in general accelerated the city's overall loss of population, while causing further racial tension between the blacks and whites, ultimately setting in motion the social forces that contributed to the city's drastic population loss after 1960. After reaching its peak in population in 1960, New Orleans experienced a steady dip in its population, with 627,000 residents in 1960 to 462,000 in 2004. Housing projects constructed in the 1930s as a part of the New Deal public housing, once legally segregated, were now being integrated in the 1960s due to the civil rights movement. The dozen or so housing projects scattered throughout the city that were once exclusively white were now primarily inhabited by thousands of the city's poorest African Americans as white residents fled to the suburbs. War refugees from Vietnam and Central America also began adapting to suburban lifestyles in Kenner and eastern New Orleans and the West Bank. Canal Street, prior to the 1964 decision, was a bustling retail and commercial center, but due to limited access of the streetcar, getting to Canal Street was proving itself to be extremely difficult with parking problems and heavy traffic. The difficulty of getting Canal Street drove business out of the area, and it lost its status as the most convenient shopping area. Doctors' offices, restaurants, and boutiques that once lined Canal began to move to suburban office parks and malls that were more accessible than Canal Street. These push factors of the city caused New Orleans to fall from the 16th place in metropolitan statistical areas in population in 1950 to 35th in the year 2000. Of the remaining residents in New Orleans in 2004, 2/3 of the residents were black. The wealthy white residents still in the city cling onto the higher elevation side of the French Quarter through Uptown and in low-lying Lakeview. Middle-class African Americans, including those of Creole ancestry, inhabited the eastern half of the city, and poorer African Americans lived in historical former back of the town along High Riverfront. And just to note, the port, oil, and tourist enterprises in New Orleans lacked the generative power of the technology industries that boomed elsewhere in the United States in the late 20th century. Therefore, in a post-war economy, New Orleans struggled to maintain fiscal stability as industrial projects waned. The solution proposed to the economic crisis was to promote New Orleans as a tourist attraction to gain tax revenues to maintain the city. As urban population declined along with income tax revenues, the New Orleans politicians and elite looked to visitors and tourists to supplement the needed income for the local budget. The focus became increased entertainment and security while hiding the poverty, struggles, and protests of the residents of the city, all but served to add to New Orleans' already faltering image, creating this sort of lost city feeling, abandoned by the end of the century. In regards to other areas of socioeconomic struggle, when it came to celebrations in New Orleans, women were usually left out of the public eye. For decades, women had been set aside from the Mardi Gras parade as it was customary for only crews of men to be on the floats. Women would finally be given the opportunity to participate in the Mardi Gras celebrations when the debutante event was combined with the parade as a way of saving money. By the late 1930s, the presence of women would become so vast that the women began to ask for a crew that they could call their own. With the pressure of representation, the first crew would be formed in 1941 and would be given the name Venus. The idea that women had entered the festivities would enrage the male audience that in the first parade, the crew of the Venus would face protests and ridicule in the form of vegetables being thrown at them. This would not stop women from participating. By 1959, Mardi Gras would have a second female crew by the name of Iris. After 1959, various celebrations would arise due to the creation of suburbs, and with it, a greater wave of female crews arose. And in regards to other entertainment factors within the city, in 1960, local leaders formed the Greater New Orleans Tourist and Convention Commission, a forerunner to the current New Orleans Metropolitan Convention and Visitors Bureau, to promote New Orleans as an international scale and plan for long-range tourism development. Also, during the 1970s and 1980s, political and economic elites joined forces to build the Louisiana Superdome, the Riverfront Mall, and the Ernst Memorial Convention Center, the Aquarium of the Americas, and a variety of other tourist attractions. Since the 1980s, the city has hosted many mega events, including the 1984 World's Fair, periodic Super Bowls and Sugar Bowls, and the NCAA basketball tournaments, the Jazz and Heritage Festival, and the Essence Festival. Nevertheless, overall convention attendance increased more than 20 times from 1960 to 2001, a development that reflects the growth of a vast tourism infrastructure of restaurants, festival promotions, professional sports, hotel and motel accommodations, university programs in tourism management and service, and so on. With that being said, the latter half of the 20th century revealed that New Orleans was increasingly becoming a popular tourist attraction, which was a plan successfully acted out by the local government, but the number of actual residents was still declining due to tensions in the city that caused many residents and businesses alike to flee.
I don't care what the weatherman says when the weatherman says it's
On the eve of Katrina, New Orleans laid claim to a host of dubious records. In 2005, 24% of residents lived below the poverty level, compared to 13% of the United States as a whole. 17% had less than a complete high school education, compared with 15% for the United States. The median household income was $30,000 compared with $46,000 for the entire nation. Those figures were even worse for the city's black residents. New Orleans' history of racial differentiation had created a class of residents who were exceptionally vulnerable to the catastrophe that occurred on August 29, 2005. But in regards to its immigration after Katrina, the main source of immigrants came by the demand of increased labor needs that Katrina caused. Foreign-born Hispanics migrants were the first to respond to that demand, and although many New Orleans were unprepared to see those unfamiliar faces and hear strange languages in the nearly empty city, the newcomer Latino migrants were the rapid response labor force that was necessary to reconstruct New Orleans. Regardless, the incoming of the immigration was met with conflicting ideas that ultimately revealed how willing the United States government is to use exploitive labor to rebuild its nation, which is an unfortunate recurring theme in its history. This became apparent when the federal government welcomed the labor force by suspending the Davis-Bacon Act, mandating that federal contractors pay prevailing wages, and by waiving sanctions against employers who hired undocumented workers, thereby letting market forces reign. Additionally, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina shed light to a lot of the segregation and discrepancies post-Brown versus Board of Education between the white and black populace in the city, as well as the media's perception of the events. While many of the onlookers who were placing blame on the residents who didn't leave when the hurricane hit, most of the evacuees, who were poor and black, had a much tougher time leaving the city, and the reason some didn't leave was because of a lack of resources that were available to them. Not only that, the media's perception and coverage of the events after Katrina were all skewed and racially biased, with one picture perceiving African Americans getting groceries for their families as looters, and the whites doing the same as survivors. The media was also criticized for their use of the term refugee, as many of the people who were still there felt that the word meant that they were second-class citizens. Also, many black pundits covering the stories talked about how quick and ready they were in the predominantly white neighborhoods, but in black neighborhoods, the response time was a lot slower, taking days and days for any relief effort to show up. Studies have confirmed these statements as FEMA trailers were offered 63% in St. Bernard Parish, a predominantly white area, and 13% in Lower Ninth Ward, which is predominantly black. Katrina victims were forced to fend for themselves after only a few months of temporary housing offered, and while many were able to use the tents, most had to find shelter on their own. A study conducted by CNN also showed that about $85 million that was supposed to be for Katrina relief went to other agencies. With this study, along with other discrepancies, this shows that there was some sort of racial discrimination in the disaster relief policies during the aftermath of Katrina. Once flooded neighborhoods were ready to be rebuilt, most of the building permits offered were given to Lakeview, an affluent white neighborhood where landowners decided to do away with traditional shotgun houses for McMansions. While most residents did build McMansions, some people decided to keep a more traditional home, causing for a juxtaposition of big houses and small houses, creating a new streetscape. The rebuilding of the lower income neighborhoods, such as the Upper Ninth Ward, took a longer time due to the nature of the neighborhood being a primarily renter-occupied area. Habitat for Humanity took the job of rebuilding 72 houses in an area known as Music Village, adopting the traditional shotgun houses, leaving a streetscape more reminiscent of what New Orleans actually looked like before Katrina. A concern for post-Katrina residents of New Orleans is public transportation, with most residents feeling that streetcars are essential for New Orleans to rebuild. The continued development of streetcars in post-Katrina New Orleans has allowed for diverse mixed use of land joining commercial corridors in neighborhood areas outside of the downtown business district. Moreover, out of the damage and social chaos, women and their children were most affected by Hurricane Katrina. Women in New Orleans made up 54% of the population in 2005. After Katrina, it is said that 80% of the women were left behind to cope with such devastation. Katrina posed a new threat to women as they would become victims of gender-based violence after the hurricane and years to come. It is estimated that shortly after Katrina hit, violence towards women rose from 4.6 cases per 100,000 female residents per day to about 16 per 100,000 just after a year. Violence towards women is believed to have risen as a result of women being displaced to temporary shelters and trailers. As a way to call attention to government, female groups like the Women of the Storm would form to call the attention of politicians in hopes in inviting them to see the aftermath firsthand. In January 2006, only 12 U.S. senators and 25 members of the House of Representatives had taken time to go to New Orleans. By the second or third week of January, the Women of the Storm were able to get 36 members to visit, which would later influence the government to pass the Road Home Restoration Program. To this day, the effects have affected the African American female population as demographics have changed significantly from 54% to about 52% on 2010. The greatest numbers come from African American women, who made up 47% of inhabitants to 37%. In the aftermath of Katrina, the CVB and other tourism organizations have elaborated on their past branding campaigns to create new campaigns and alter people's perceptions of New Orleans, using brand elements such as new slogans and logos. In April 2006, the Louisiana Recovery Authority earmarked $30 million for tourism and convention marketing. The CVB is using a portion of this money to re-image and rebrand the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center, the site of the internationally televised humanitarian crisis in the days after Hurricane Katrina. Since 2005, bitter conflict has been created by efforts to attract corporate sponsors to underwrite the cost of Mardi Gras celebrations, as well as Jazz and Heritage Festival. Indeed, promotional efforts depict French Quarter and other tourist spaces as hermetically sealed enclaves that are safe and crime-free. The latest attempts to appeal to tourists by city leaders have been to provide shopping, dining, and entertainments in themed and controlled environments. This trend in development has been called Disneyification. And beginning in January of 2006, Gray Line New Orleans Bus Tours began offering its Hurricane Katrina, America's Worst Catastrophe tour through devastated neighborhoods. The bus tour presents flooded neighborhoods as a spectacular and entertaining sights to visit. New Orleans neighborhoods affected by Katrina are remade into abstract representations, with viewers constituted as consumers and disaster constructed as a consumable spectacle. Many locals, especially residents of the French Quarter, assert that tourism in recent decades has changed to a point where the corporate brands are taking over large areas and thereby homogenizing space and destroying the cultural fabric of the city. These large entertainment corporations can bring a lot of pressure to the city. Individual business owners do not have as much power as a big corporation, and therefore they cannot get as much. Thus, as you can see, in the post-war era, the New Orleans experienced a unique account of American suburbanization counteracted by the chaotic racial and cultural mixture that the city possesses, and after a new millennium, Hurricane Katrina wiped out and reset New Orleans' social and political structures in 2005, sparking particularly high tensions in an unprecedented context, creating an essential example of a forgotten city in this hyper-capitalist, globalized world.